90 days after they vanished, the two sisters were found tied to a tree deep inside the forest. They were unconscious, severely malnourished, and somehow still alive. The ropes had cut into their skin. Their bodies were barely able to support their own weight. For 3 months, no one knew where they were, or if they were still breathing. And yet, against all logic, against everything the wilderness should have claimed from them, Emily and Laura Carter were found standing upright, bound to a single tree, in the middle of one of the most remote forests in Washington state. What happened to them during those 90 days would leave investigators struggling to explain not only how they survived, but why they were allowed to before the forest became a place of fear. Before it turned into a crime scene, it was simply a destination, a quiet escape, a familiar stretch of wilderness that Emily and Laura Carter believed they understood. Emily Carter was 26 years old. She worked as a freelance photographer, spending most of her time behind a camera, chasing natural light and quiet moments. Friends described her as observant, reserved, someone who noticed details others overlooked. Laura, 3 years older, was the opposite in temperament. At 29, she was an elementary school teacher, organized, practical, and deeply routine-driven. Where Emily followed instinct, Laura followed plans. Despite their differences, the sisters were close in a way that rarely faded with adulthood. They spoke nearly every day. They shared an unspoken rhythm built over decades of growing up together in a small town outside Portland. Their bond was strongest in the outdoors, where conversation came easily and silence was never uncomfortable. Their mother, Margaret Carter, had raised them to respect nature but not fear it. Weekend hikes had been part of their childhood. Camping trips were never spontaneous. Routes were researched, supplies were double-checked. Emily and Laura were not reckless adventurers. They were careful, methodical, predictable. That was why no one questioned their plan for the second weekend of September. The Northridge Forest was not unfamiliar territory. It wasn't an untouched wilderness known only to survivalists. It was a protected national forest, dense and expansive, but marked with established trails and designated camping areas. Emily and Laura had visited it before, always returning home with photographs, tired smiles, and stories that ended without incident. On the morning of their departure, the weather was calm. Early autumn had just begun to touch the forest, cooling the air without stripping the trees of their color. The sisters packed lightly but efficiently. 2 backpacks, enough food for a weekend, a compact first aid kit, and weatherproof jackets folded neatly on top. Before leaving, Laura texted their mother, "Back by Sunday night." "Same trail as last time," Margaret replied almost immediately. "Be careful. Call me when you set up camp." At 8:12 a.m., their silver SUV pulled into the Northridge Forest Trailhead parking lot. A small sign stood nearby, reminding visitors to sign the registry and note their intended route. Emily filled it out carefully, her handwriting clear and unhurried. The sisters listed a 2-day loop trail, one that cut through dense fir trees before opening near a river basin several miles in. A park ranger on duty that morning later recalled them without hesitation. 2 women, confident, relaxed, not rushed. They didn't ask questions. They didn't hesitate. Nothing about them suggested uncertainty or concern. They disappeared into the tree line just after 8:30 a.m. For most of that first day, everything followed expectation. The trail was narrow but visible, packed earth softened by fallen needles. The forest canopy filtered the sunlight, casting long, shifting shadows across the ground. Birds moved overhead. Water ran somewhere unseen but constant. At 6:41 p.m., Laura sent the final message anyone would ever receive from either sister. "Camp's set. Weather's holding. Talk tomorrow." Margaret read it from her kitchen table and smiled. She placed her phone face down, unaware that the routine she trusted was already breaking apart. Sunday came and went quietly. By early afternoon, Margaret sent another message. No response. That didn't worry her. Cell service in the forest was unreliable. Emily and Laura had warned her of that before. By early evening she called. It went straight to voicemail. She told herself the same thing she always did. They were tired. They'd call when they got signal. But by 9 p.m., unease began to replace reassurance. Laura never forgot to check in, never. Margaret stayed awake past midnight, her phone beside her on the table. It remained silent. Monday morning arrived without resolution. Emily didn't respond to a client email. Laura didn't show up at her classroom. By mid-morning, Margaret was no longer waiting. She was driving. The Northridge Forest parking lot looked exactly the way it should have. The sisters' SUV was still there, locked, undisturbed, a thin layer of dust already settling across the windshield. Nothing was broken. Nothing was missing. Their car looked as if they had every intention of returning to it. Margaret stood beside it for a long moment, staring into the trees where the trail disappeared. This was not how hiking trips ended. When she reported her daughters missing later that day, the responding officer noted something that would quietly shape the entire investigation. There was no sign of panic, no sign of struggle, no sign that Emily and Laura Carter had planned anything other than a simple weekend in the woods, and that, more than anything else, was what made their disappearance so deeply unsettling. Sunday morning passed without incident, at least on the surface. Margaret Carter woke early, as she always did, and checked her phone before leaving the bedroom. There were no new messages. She told herself this was normal. The forest swallowed signal. Emily and Laura had warned her about that countless times. Still, she left her phone on the kitchen counter instead of in her purse, glancing at it each time she passed. By midday, the unease began to settle in more firmly. It wasn't panic yet. It was something quieter, heavier, the kind of feeling that didn't announce itself but refused to leave. Margaret sent another text shortly after noon, a simple question asking if they were on their way back. The message showed as sent, but not delivered. She waited. Outside, the day moved on without urgency. Cars passed, neighbors mowed lawns. Somewhere, children laughed. The world behaved exactly as it always did, and that normalcy felt wrong. By late afternoon, Margaret called Laura's phone again. Voicemail. She tried Emily next. The same result. She stood in the kitchen, phone pressed to her ear, listening to the recorded greeting she'd heard 1,000 times before, and felt a subtle shift take place. This wasn't just poor reception anymore. Laura never ignored her mother's calls. Never. At 6 p.m., the time Laura had promised they would likely be heading back, Margaret sat down at the table and waited. She told herself that delays happened. Trails took longer than expected. Fatigue slowed people down. She reminded herself that her daughters were capable, experienced, responsible. But as daylight faded and evening settled in, the silence grew louder. By 9:30 p.m., the worry could no longer be dismissed as imagination. Margaret paced between the kitchen and the living room, phone in hand, dialing the same numbers again and again. Each unanswered call tightened the knot in her chest. She slept little that night, waking repeatedly to check for missed calls that never came. Monday morning arrived without answers. At 8 a.m., Emily failed to show up for a scheduled call with a client. At 8:30, Laura's school called Margaret, asking if everything was all right. Laura had never been late without notice, not once in her 7 years of teaching. Margaret didn't hesitate anymore. She drove to the Northridge Forest, just after 10 a.m., the road familiar but suddenly oppressive. The forest looked unchanged. Tall firs lined the highway. The air was cool, peaceful. Nothing about it suggested danger. The parking lot came into view slowly, and when Margaret saw the silver SUV still sitting in the same place it had been 2 days earlier, her fear sharpened into certainty. The vehicle was locked. There were no signs of damage, no broken glass, no notes left behind. Inside, everything was as it should have been. Spare shoes, a folded map, empty coffee cups from the drive up. It looked like a car waiting for its owners to return. Margaret stood beside it, staring at the tree line. She called out their names once, her voice small and swallowed quickly by the forest. There was no response. When the Skamania County Sheriff's Office received the report later that morning, the case was initially treated as a delayed return. It wasn't unusual for hikers to underestimate time. But several details immediately stood out to Deputy Thomas Reed, the officer assigned to take the initial statement. Emily and Laura Carter had been prepared. They had left a clear route plan.
They had not taken unnecessary risks, their car had not moved, and more importantly, there had been no contact at all. No call, no text, no emergency signal. Reed drove to the trailhead that afternoon. He walked the perimeter of the parking lot, photographed the vehicle, and checked the visitor registry. Emily's handwriting was still visible on the page, unremarkable in every way. 2-day loop. Expected return Sunday evening. He followed the trail on foot for nearly an hour, noting nothing out of place. No abandoned gear, no obvious disturbances. The forest was quiet, but not unnaturally so. If someone had passed through recently, they had left no clear trace. By late afternoon, the situation could no longer be categorized as a simple delay. Search and rescue protocols were initiated quietly at first. A small team assembled. Rangers reviewed the trail maps. Weather reports were pulled. Conditions over the weekend had been stable. No storms, no flash floods, nothing that should have turned a familiar hike into a disappearance. Margaret waited at home, phone clutched in her hands, watching the hours slip away. Each passing minute without news deepened the same unrelenting thought. People didn't just vanish like this, not without leaving something behind. And as the sun began to set on the second day since her daughters had last been seen, the forest remained silent, holding whatever answers it contained tightly, as if it had no intention of giving them back. By Tuesday morning, the case was no longer considered a late return. It had crossed a threshold that law enforcement knew too well, the point where time stopped working in a missing person's favor. Deputy Thomas Reed arrived at the North Ridge Forest trailhead just after sunrise. The air was cold enough to fog his breath. He stood for a moment beside the silver SUV, hands resting on his belt, scanning the area with the practiced stillness of someone trained to notice what others missed. The vehicle had not moved. A thin layer of pollen had settled along the edges of the windshield. No fresh footprints surrounded it. He photographed the car from multiple angles, documenting everything exactly as it appeared. Inside, nothing suggested panic. No discarded phones, no notes. The glove compartment held registration papers and a folded road map. In the back seat, 2 empty water bottles rolled slightly when the door opened, evidence of nothing more than an ordinary drive. Reed walked to the wooden information kiosk near the start of the trail. The visitor log was still clipped in place, its pages fluttering lightly in the breeze. Emily Carter's name sat in neat print, dated Saturday morning. The route listed was specific, a loop trail, 2 days. Nothing ambitious. That detail mattered. Hikers who disappeared often did so after deviating from their plans. But the Carter sisters had done everything right. They told someone where they were going. They signed in. They packed appropriately. They didn't vanish on impulse. Reed radioed his observations back to the sheriff's office and began walking the trail himself, following the same path Emily and Laura would have taken 3 days earlier. The ground was compacted but readable, layered with needles and damp soil. He looked for signs of disturbance, broken branches, scuffed earth, anything out of place. There was nothing. The forest felt indifferent. Birds moved between trees. Water flowed somewhere deeper inside. If 2 women had passed through recently, the land had already reclaimed their footprints. By mid-morning, Reed met with 2 park rangers who knew the area intimately. Together, they reviewed weather data. Temperatures had dipped overnight but never reached dangerous levels. No rain, no wind events, no sudden changes that could have caused disorientation or injury. One ranger pointed out something Reed had already considered. The terrain, while dense, wasn't extreme. The trail did narrow in places, tree cover was thick, but it wasn't the kind of environment where experienced hikers simply vanish without leaving equipment behind. That absence became the first true anomaly. By early afternoon, a formal search and rescue operation was initiated. At first, it was small, controlled. A grid was established around the trailhead. Teams moved outward, methodically checking areas where hikers sometimes strayed, overlooks, riverbanks, secondary paths. Margaret Carter arrived shortly after the search began. She stood at the edge of the command area, wrapped in a jacket she hadn't needed earlier that week. Her eyes followed every ranger who disappeared into the trees, then returned without answers. She spoke little. When she did, her questions were simple and repetitive. "Have you found anything? Did they go this way? Are you sure they didn't leave the trail?" Reed answered carefully. He explained the process. He explained the timeline. He avoided speculation. He did not tell her what he was already thinking, that the longer the forest remained silent, the more troubling the case became. Search dogs were brought in that afternoon. Handlers began near the campsite area listed on the registry, hoping to pick up a scent trail. The dogs moved with confidence at first, noses low, tails rigid. They followed a path consistent with the trail route for several hundred yards. Then, abruptly, the trail dissolved. The dogs circled, handlers adjusted position, commands were repeated, but the scent did not continue. It simply stopped, as if Emily and Laura had stepped off the ground entirely. That detail was logged, carefully. Without interpretation, by the end of the first day, the search perimeter expanded. Additional volunteers were called in. Helicopter support was requested for the following morning. Reed reviewed maps late into the evening, marking areas of interest, noting places where visibility dropped sharply. Nothing pointed in a single direction. Margaret returned home that night to an empty house. She left the porch light on. She kept her phone beside her pillow. When it buzzed just after midnight, her heart leapt, only to sink when she saw it was a weather alert. By Wednesday morning, the operation had grown. Helicopters swept overhead, their blades cutting through the stillness of the forest. From above, the tree canopy formed a continuous green mass, broken only by narrow ribbons of trail and occasional clearings. Visibility was limited. Whatever lay beneath the branches remained hidden. On the ground, teams continued their slow progression. They called out the sisters' names, voices echoing briefly before being swallowed by distance. They checked embankments and water crossings. They searched for torn fabric, dropped gear, anything that suggested an accident. Nothing surfaced. By late afternoon, Reed gathered his team and reviewed what they knew. 2 experienced hikers. Clear route. Stable weather. No signs of injury. No equipment found. No confirmed movement beyond a certain point. It was a pattern that didn't fit accident models, and it didn't yet fit criminal ones either. That uncertainty, the absence of explanation, settled heavily over the search. As daylight faded again, the forest remained unchanged, quiet, uncooperative. And for the first time since the search began, Reed acknowledged something he would not say out loud. This was not just a rescue operation anymore. It was the beginning of an investigation. The discovery came just after noon on Thursday, nearly 4 days after Emily and Laura Carter had last been seen. A ground team moving east of the main loop trail noticed a subtle break in the undergrowth, an area where the ferns were pressed flat and the soil beneath appeared darker, compacted by repeated pressure. It wasn't immediately obvious. In a forest like North Ridge, the ground bore countless marks left by animals, weather, and time. But this was different. This was deliberate. The team slowed their pace. At the center of the clearing sat a crude fire ring made of river stones, blackened but cold. Ash clung to the soil, damp from morning dew. Nearby, the ground showed 2 distinct depressions where a tent had likely been pitched. The shape was unmistakable. This was the campsite. Deputy Thomas Reed arrived minutes later. He stood at the edge of the clearing without stepping inside, scanning the scene as if it might rearrange itself under closer inspection. The site matched the timeline. It was roughly the distance the sisters should have covered on their first day. It aligned with the route Emily had written in the registry. Everything about it said they had arrived here safely. But what followed did not make sense. There was no tent, no sleeping bags, no backpacks, no cooking equipment, no discarded food wrappers, no clothing, no personal items of any kind. Even experienced hikers sometimes left traces behind. Forgotten utensils, torn packaging, a bootlace, something. Here, there was nothing. The clearing looked as if it had been erased. Reed photographed the fire ring, the flattened ground, the surrounding vegetation. A forensic technician collected ash samples, noting that the fire had been used recently but not within the last 24 hours. Whatever warmth it had once provided was long gone. The absence of gear immediately shifted the tone of the investigation. In most wilderness accidents, equipment told the story. A broken strap, a dropped pack, a tent abandoned in a hurry. Here, the equipment itself had vanished. Reed knelt near the edge of the campsite and examined the soil more closely. Faint impressions were visible, boot prints partially obscured by leaves and time. At least 3 sets. 2 appeared consistent with women's hiking boots. The third was larger. He noted the pattern but did not yet draw conclusions. The prints led away from the clearing, in a loose line, not following the trail. After several yards, they scattered and disappeared into an area of rocky ground where impressions could not be held. The forest had swallowed them. Search dogs were brought in again, this time focused on the campsite. The handlers watched closely as the dogs worked the perimeter. The animals moved with purpose, circling once, twice, then pulling toward the same direction the prints had gone. And then, just as before, the trail ended. No gradual fade, no branching paths. The scent simply stopped. Reed stood back as the handlers exchanged quiet words. He had seen this before. Sometimes scent trails were lost to wind or water. But here, neither explanation fit cleanly. There was no creek crossing nearby, no significant weather event to disrupt the ground. It was as if Emily and Laura Carter had ceased to exist beyond that point. Margaret Carter was escorted to the edge of the campsite later that afternoon. She did not step into the clearing. She didn't need to. One look was enough. Her eyes moved instinctively, searching for familiar shapes that were not there. "Where's their tent?" she asked quietly. No one answered right away. Reed explained what they knew. He kept his voice calm, controlled. He avoided language that suggested danger, but Margaret heard it anyway, in what wasn't being said. Her daughters had reached this place. They had settled in, and then something had removed every trace of them. She pressed her hand to her mouth, staring at the fire ring. "They wouldn't just leave their things," she said. "Not like this," Reed agreed. He had already documented that conclusion in his notes. By evening, the search radius expanded again. Teams combed the surrounding forest in widening arcs, calling out names, scanning the ground for fabric, metal, plastic. Anything that didn't belong to the woods. Nothing emerged. As daylight faded, Reed gathered the team for a briefing. He reviewed the facts carefully, separating what was known from what was suspected. Emily and Laura had arrived at the campsite. They had stayed long enough to make a fire. Their gear had not been found. There were footprints, but no equipment trail. No signs of struggle, no blood, no indication of an accident, and yet they were gone. This was the moment the case shifted. Up to now, the forest itself had been the presumed threat. Exposure, injury, disorientation. But the campsite told a different story, one that did not align with natural explanations alone. Someone, or something, had intervened after the sisters arrived, and whatever had happened next had been thorough enough to leave the forest looking untouched. As night settled in again, the clearing remained silent. The fire ring cold, the ground bare, and for the first time since the search began, investigators were forced to confront a possibility they had hoped to avoid. Emily and Laura Carter had not simply been lost. They had been taken. By Friday morning, the search had grown beyond the boundaries of a routine rescue operation. What had begun as a controlled response now pulled in resources from multiple agencies, each addition underscoring a truth no one wanted to speak aloud. Helicopters arrived shortly after dawn. Their blades cut through the cool air as they lifted above the tree line, sweeping low over the forest canopy. From the ground, the sound was constant, mechanical, out of place. From above, the forest revealed very little. The trees formed an unbroken ceiling of green and shadow, hiding everything beneath them. Clearings were rare. Riverbanks were narrow. Whatever lay below was protected by layers of branches and time. On the ground, search teams expanded outward from the abandoned campsite in a widening grid. Rangers moved methodically, scanning the forest floor for unnatural shapes or colors. Volunteers followed behind, instructed not to disturb anything they found. Every scrap of plastic, every torn leaf, every indentation in the soil was examined and logged. Dogs were deployed again, this time rotating through multiple handlers to rule out error. Each attempt ended the same way. The scent would rise briefly, pull forward, then vanish without explanation. There were no creek crossings to explain it, no steep drop-offs, no evidence of the sisters entering water. The forest offered no physical reason for the trail to end so completely. Deputy Thomas Reed reviewed the reports as they came in, his notes growing longer and more precise. He documented weather conditions hourly, wind direction, ground temperature, humidity, all factors that could influence scent tracking. None accounted for what they were seeing. The longer the search continued without results, the heavier the questions became. Search divers were brought in to examine sections of the nearby river where currents slowed and debris collected. They entered the water carefully, moving upstream and down, scanning submerged logs and rock formations. Nothing surfaced, no clothing, no equipment, no signs of a fall. By midday, media crews began to appear at the edge of the command area. Cameras remained at a distance, but their presence changed the atmosphere immediately. Reporters spoke in low voices, careful with their words, asking questions that did not yet have answers. 2 experienced hikers, prepared, gone without a trace. Margaret Carter stood nearby, watching as strangers spoke her daughter's names into microphones. She listened as theories were offered: injury, disorientation, wildlife encounters. Each suggestion felt hollow. She knew Emily and Laura. They would have left something behind, a sound, a sign, a signal. Instead, there was only absence. Reed avoided speculation during press briefings. He stuck to facts. Timeline, resources deployed, areas covered. He refused to classify the case as criminal without evidence. But privately, the campsite continued to trouble him. Equipment didn't disappear on its own. People didn't simply evaporate. As the afternoon wore on, volunteers rotated in shifts, exhaustion setting in. The forest demanded effort at every step. Thick undergrowth slowed progress. Fallen logs blocked paths. Visibility dropped sharply beyond a few yards. If someone wanted to move unseen, this was a place that allowed it. Late in the day, one of the ground teams reported a possible lead: a torn fragment of synthetic fabric caught on a low branch several hundred yards from the campsite. The piece was small, weathered, and inconclusive. It could have belonged to any number of hikers over the years. Still, it was logged, photographed, bagged. It went nowhere. By evening, the search perimeter had reached its practical limits. Teams had covered every reasonable deviation from the trail, every ravine, every slope where a misstep might have occurred. No injuries were found, no bodies, no evidence of an accident severe enough to explain total disappearance. Margaret returned home again that night. The house felt wrong without the quiet sounds of her daughter's routines. She left the lights on in the hallway. She checked her phone compulsively, refreshing the screen as if doing so might summon a message that refused to arrive. The community followed the search closely. Flyers appeared in shop windows and on bulletin boards. Local hikers volunteered their time. Social media posts spread the sisters' photos beyond the region, carrying hope outward even as answers failed to come back. On the 7th day, the sheriff's office made a decision no family ever wants to hear. The active search would be scaled back. Resources were finite. With no new leads and no confirmed direction of travel, maintaining full deployment was no longer feasible. The case would remain open. Patrols would continue. Any new information would be acted on immediately, but the forest would no longer be filled with voices calling Emily and Laura's names. Margaret listened as the explanation was delivered. She nodded. She understood the words. She did not accept their meaning. As the final teams packed their equipment and the helicopters lifted away one last time, the forest returned to its natural state, quiet, dense, unchanged. Whatever had happened after Emily and Laura Carter set up camp had left no trace strong enough to follow, and as the search receded, a heavier truth settled over everyone involved. If the forest wasn't giving them answers now, it might never give them at all. The announcement was brief, delivered without ceremony. The active search for Emily and Laura Carter was being suspended. Deputy Thomas Reed stood beside the sheriff as the decision was explained to the family. Resources had been exhausted. Search grids had been covered multiple times. There were no confirmed leads pointing in any direction. The case would remain open, they said. Patrols would continue. Tips would be followed. But the large-scale operation, the helicopters, the dogs, the teams moving shoulder to shoulder through the forest, was over. For Margaret Carter, the words sounded distant, almost abstract. She understood what they meant, but her mind refused to accept them fully. Her daughters were still out there, somewhere. Ending the search felt less like a logistical decision and more like a quiet surrender. She returned home that afternoon to a house frozen in time. Laura's jacket still hung on the back of a chair. Emily's camera bag sat untouched near the door. Margaret did not move them. She couldn't. To do so would have felt like admitting something she wasn't ready to believe. Days passed. Then weeks. The forest began to change. By early October, the air turned sharper. Leaves shifted from green to muted yellow, then fell, carpeting the ground and concealing whatever traces might have remained. Rain returned, soaking the soil, erasing footprints that had once been faint but visible. If the forest had been withholding answers before, it was now actively burying them. Reed reviewed the case file repeatedly. Each time he followed the same path: vehicle left behind, clear route plan, abandoned campsite, vanished scent trail. The facts did not rearrange themselves into something that made sense. They simply sat there, incomplete. There were no credible sightings, no confirmed tips. Each call that came in raised brief hope before dissolving into another dead end. A woman seen walking near a highway, a camper who thought he heard voices weeks earlier. None of it held. As October turned into November, the temperature dropped steadily. The first frost settled over the forest floor, followed by light snow at higher elevations. Trails closed. Access points became impassable. Whatever chance remained of finding Emily and Laura alive diminished with each passing night. Margaret continued to wait. She kept her phone charged at all times. She slept lightly, waking at the smallest sound. When it rang unexpectedly, her heart raced, only to slow again when the caller was a telemarketer or a friend checking in. The community did not forget right away. Candlelight vigils were held. Flyers were replaced when rain tore them down. Strangers stopped Margaret in grocery stores, offering condolences that felt premature and hope that felt fragile. But time has a way of thinning attention. By December, the story faded from the news cycle. New tragedies replaced it. Other disappearances took its place. Emily and Laura Carter became names remembered quietly rather than spoken aloud. Winter settled in fully. Snow blanketed the North Ridge forest, covering trails, logs, and clearings alike. What had once been a place of movement became static and hostile. Only the most experienced winter hikers ventured inside now, and even they did so cautiously. Reed knew the statistics. Survival beyond a certain point became improbable. Exposure, dehydration, starvation, nature did not negotiate. And yet something about this case resisted closure. The campsite, the missing equipment, the way the trail had simply ended. It did not feel like the forest alone. Margaret refused to give up. She contacted missing persons organizations. She joined online forums. She spoke to anyone who claimed to have insight, no matter how unlikely. Each conversation ended the same way, with uncertainty. Christmas came and went without celebration. Emily would have turned 27 in January. Laura's birthday followed shortly after. Margaret marked both days quietly, lighting candles and sitting alone at the kitchen table long after nightfall. 3 months passed. 90 days since the last text message. 90 days since anyone had heard their voices. 90 days since the forest had taken them in and offered nothing in return. By mid-December, even Reed began to assume the worst. He did not voice it. He could not. But the case had settled into a familiar, grim category, one where answers came slowly, if at all, and often too late. Then, on the morning of December 14th, the forest broke its silence. The days that followed passed without markers. No calls came in. No new sightings were reported. The case file remained open but untouched, resting in a stack of other unsolved disappearances that all shared the same quiet ending, nothing more to follow. Margaret Carter continued her routine because stopping it felt dangerous. She woke early. She made coffee she rarely finished. She kept the radio on low volume, not for company, but to break the silence that pressed too hard against the walls. Every morning, she checked her phone before her feet touched the floor. Every night, she placed it within reach of her pillow. The forest existed now only as an idea. Snow had closed most access points. Rangers moved through it less frequently. Whatever remained inside was frozen. preserved beneath layers of ice and shadow. Deputy Thomas Reed checked in with Margaret once a week. The conversations grew shorter. There was less to report. Each call ended the same way, with reassurances that felt thinner every time they were repeated. Nothing new had surfaced. 3 months was a threshold Reed understood well. Survival curves dropped sharply after that point. Exposure did not leave room for exceptions. And yet, the case continued to resist finality. The missing equipment, the erased trail, the absence of any natural explanation that fit cleanly, the silence itself felt wrong. On December 14th, the temperature rose slightly, just enough to soften the top layer of snow without melting it completely. The forest shifted, subtle and slow, as it often did before revealing anything at all. That morning, a wildlife biologist named Daniel Moore drove past the last maintained road and parked his truck near a locked service gate. His work took him far beyond marked trails, into areas few people entered willingly. He had spent years navigating terrain like this, moving quietly, deliberately, paying attention to details most would miss. He walked alone. Moore moved through the forest with measured steps, scanning tree lines and open spaces, noting animal tracks partially preserved beneath the snow. His focus was narrow, methodical. He was not looking for people. When he first saw the shapes, he didn't stop. At a distance, they appeared vertical and motionless, 2 dark forms pressed against a wide tree trunk. His initial thought was simple and dismissive. Equipment, markers, something left behind. He took several more steps before the scene registered fully. The shapes were human. Moore stopped where he stood, heart rate rising sharply as his eyes adjusted. 2 figures, standing upright, heads tilted forward. Their bodies were bound tightly to the tree with thick rope, wrapped around torsos and limbs so completely they appeared fused to the trunk itself. For a moment, he could not move. The forest was silent except for his own breathing. Snow crunched faintly beneath his boots as he stepped closer, every instinct telling him something was profoundly wrong. The figures did not sway, they did not react. Their clothing was torn, discolored, hanging loosely from frames that looked far too thin to be alive. And yet, something about the way they stood suggested they had not fallen. Moore reached the edge of the clearing and stopped again. He did not touch them. He did not speak. He took in the details slowly, as if his mind needed time to accept what his eyes were seeing. 2 women, bound, unmoving. He pulled out his satellite phone with hands that shook despite years of fieldwork. When the dispatcher answered, his voice remained steady only because he forced it to be. He gave coordinates. He described what he saw. He emphasized the most important detail, the one he could not yet confirm but felt compelled to say anyway. They might still be alive. As the call ended, Moore stood alone in the forest, watching the 2 figures tied to the tree. Snow drifted gently through the branches above them, settling on shoulders that did not move. 90 days after Emily and Laura Carter had vanished, the forest had finally answered. And the answer was far worse and far more unbelievable than anyone had imagined. Daniel Moore did not approach them immediately. Training held him in place. Years in the field had taught him that scenes like this could be deceptive, dangerous, or both. He forced himself to breathe slowly, to observe before acting. The ropes were thick, nylon, looped around the trunk of the tree in overlapping coils. Whoever had tied them knew what they were doing. The knots were tight, deliberate, placed to hold weight. The women were standing, not slumped on the ground. Their bodies were held upright by the bindings alone. Heads bowed forward, hair matted and frozen in places. Their clothing, once practical hiking gear, was torn, stiff with dirt, and hanging loosely from frames that looked painfully fragile. Moore took a step closer. He spoke quietly, unsure why. "Can you hear me?" There was no response. The forest did not react either. No birds, no wind. Just stillness, as if the space itself was holding its breath. He closed the remaining distance carefully and positioned himself to the side of the nearest woman. Her face was pale beneath streaks of grime, lips cracked, skin drawn tight across cheekbones that stood out sharply. She did not appear to be breathing. Moore reached out with 2 fingers and touched the side of her neck. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, faint, irregular but unmistakable. He felt it. A pulse. He pulled his hand back as if burned. His chest tightened, shock crashing through him in waves. Against every reasonable expectation, against everything the wilderness should have allowed, she was alive. He moved to the second woman, hands trembling now, and repeated the motion. Another pulse, weaker. But there, they were both alive. Barely. Moore stepped back, heart pounding, mind racing through possibilities that made no sense. 3 months, winter conditions, no shelter, no visible food or water. And yet their bodies were still fighting. He raised the satellite phone again and relayed the update to the dispatcher. Alive. Unconscious. Bound. Immediate medical evacuation required. The response was swift. Coordinates were transmitted to multiple agencies. A helicopter was dispatched from the nearest ranger station, capable of winter extraction. Ground teams began mobilizing, navigating toward Moore's location using GPS and topographical data. The forest, that had been silent for months, suddenly stirred with urgency. Moore stayed where he was, monitoring the women from a distance. He did not touch the ropes. He did not attempt to wake them. He watched their chests for the smallest signs of movement, counting seconds between breaths. Each one felt too long. Within 40 minutes, the sound of rotors cut through the canopy overhead. Snow swirled as the helicopter circled, searching for a break in the trees wide enough to land. When it finally touched down in a nearby clearing, paramedics moved quickly, carrying equipment across uneven ground, boots sinking into snow softened by midday thaw. They stopped short when they saw the scene. None of them spoke at first. 2 women, upright, bound, still breathing. One of the paramedics, Jennifer Whitmore, later said it was the most disturbing thing she had seen in her career, not because of visible violence, but because of the precision. The women were not discarded. They were positioned, held in place long after their bodies should have failed. Vital signs were checked immediately. Blood pressure dangerously low. Heart rates erratic. Body temperatures hovering just above fatal thresholds. Their skin showed deep ligature marks around wrists, ankles, and torsos, evidence of prolonged restraint. Hands and feet were swollen, discolored from restricted circulation. The ropes were cut carefully, one section at a time, to avoid sudden collapse. As the final bindings were released, both women folded forward, their weight caught by the paramedics before they hit the ground. They were placed on stretchers and wrapped in thermal blankets. 4 fluids were started on site. Oxygen masks were secured. The entire process was carried out with controlled urgency, every movement measured. As the women were lifted toward the helicopter, one of them made a sound. It was barely audible, a shallow exhale that caught somewhere between breath and voice. Her eyes did not open, but the sound alone confirmed what the monitors already showed. She was still fighting. The flight to the hospital was tense and quiet. Medical staff worked continuously, monitoring vitals, adjusting fluids, preventing shock. There were no conversations about motives or suspects, only survival. At Legacy Regional Medical Center, a trauma team was waiting. Doctors moved with disbelief, sharpened by discipline. The initial assessment painted a grim picture: severe dehydration, advanced malnutrition, hypothermia, muscle atrophy consistent with prolonged immobilization, pressure injuries along the back and legs suggesting the women had been forced to remain upright for extended periods. One physician quietly admitted later that statistically, neither woman should have been alive. Emily Carter had lost nearly 40 pounds. Laura Carter slightly less, but both were operating on the edge of organ failure. Their bodies had cannibalized muscle tissue to survive. Electrolyte levels were critically low. Infections were present where the ropes had cut into skin, and still they lived. Deputy Thomas Reed arrived at the hospital shortly after the helicopter landed. He stood behind the glass as the sisters were rushed into separate trauma bays, machines surrounding them, voices overlapping in clipped medical language. 90 days earlier, they had vanished without explanation. Now they had returned, alive, but carrying a story no one yet understood. Reed reviewed the preliminary reports that evening: the bindings, the rope material, the location. None of it pointed to accident or misadventure. This was not survival gone wrong, this was restraint, prolonged, intentional. The forest had not taken the Carter sisters. Someone else had. Margaret Carter was notified just after sunset. When she arrived at the hospital, she did not cry at first. She stood at the nurse's station, hands pressed together, listening as doctors explained conditions and probabilities. Alive, they said. Critical, but alive. Only then did her knees weaken. She was allowed to see them briefly, one at a time. Tubes and wires obscured much of what she recognized. But their faces were still theirs. Changed, gaunt, but unmistakable. Margaret whispered their names, afraid to speak louder. Afraid that sound itself might pull them back into whatever darkness they had come from. That night, the story broke. 2 missing sisters found alive after 3 months in the forest, bound to a tree, unconscious. Questions spread faster than answers. Who had done this? Why were they left alive? And how long had someone been watching them suffer? As investigators secured the discovery site and began treating it as a crime scene, one truth became unavoidable. The search had ended, but the real investigation was only just beginning. Inside the hospital, time moved differently. In the intensive care unit, Emily and Laura Carter lay in separate rooms, surrounded by machines that hummed softly through the night. 4 lines delivered fluids at a controlled pace. Warming blankets were layered carefully over their bodies, raising core temperatures by fractions of a degree at a time. Doctors worked deliberately, aware that too much intervention too quickly could be just as dangerous as doing nothing at all. The initial medical reports were sobering. Both women were severely dehydrated, their bodies deprived of consistent water intake for an extended period. Blood tests revealed electrolyte imbalances so extreme they bordered on fatal. Potassium levels were dangerously low, sodium levels erratic. Their organs were functioning but barely, strained by months of deprivation. Malnutrition was advanced. Emily had lost close to 40 pounds. Laura slightly less, but the damage was similar. Muscle tissue had wasted away, particularly in the legs and core. Their bodies had entered a prolonged state of metabolic survival, consuming themselves in a desperate attempt to remain alive. What troubled the medical team most, however, were the restraint injuries. Deep ligature marks encircled wrists, ankles, and torsos. In some areas, the skin had broken down entirely, forming infected pressure wounds. Swelling and discoloration in the hands and feet suggested circulation had been compromised for long periods of time. Nerve damage was suspected. In one case, doctors worried about permanent loss of sensation. The positioning of the injuries told its own story. These were not short-term restraints. The marks were too deep, too uniform. They indicated prolonged binding, likely over weeks. Pressure sores along the backs of the legs and hips suggested that the women had been forced to remain upright for extended periods, unable to sit or lie down long enough to relieve stress on their bodies. One trauma nurse, Paul Henley, later said that the standing injuries were what haunted him most. "The human body isn't designed for that," he explained. "You can't stay upright and restrained for that long without help. Someone had to be controlling the situation." That observation would quietly reshape the investigation. Doctors ruled out several explanations almost immediately. The sisters had not survived by foraging. Their digestive systems showed no signs of recent solid intake. They had not built shelter. Exposure injuries were present, but controlled. They had not wandered aimlessly. They had been kept. How long and by whom remained unanswered. Deputy Thomas Reed met with the attending physicians the following morning. The conversation was clinical, restrained by professional language, but the implications were clear. Survival under those conditions was statistically improbable. The fact that both women were alive suggested outside intervention, just enough to keep them from dying, but not enough to allow recovery. Someone had been monitoring them. The hospital restricted access to the sisters' rooms. Security was posted. Investigators wanted to preserve any chance of uncontaminated testimony once they regained consciousness. For now, Emily and Laura remained unresponsive, their bodies too weak to support awareness. Margaret Carter stayed nearby, sleeping in a chair when she could, refusing to leave the building. She watched the monitors rise and fall, clinging to the rhythm of each heartbeat as proof that her daughters were still there. On the third day after their rescue, a subtle change occurred. Laura's fingers moved. It was small, almost imperceptible. A slight flex beneath the blanket, but the nurse noticed immediately. Doctors were called. Vitals were checked. Laura's eyelids fluttered briefly before closing again. Hope entered the room cautiously. Later that evening, Laura opened her eyes fully for the first time. Confusion registered immediately. Her gaze moved slowly across the room, struggling to focus. The machines, the lights, the unfamiliar ceiling. Panic followed instinctively, heart rate spiking as memory failed to connect with reality. A nurse stepped in quickly, speaking softly, grounding her with simple reassurances. She was safe. She was in a hospital. Her sister was alive. Laura's breathing slowed. Then she whispered, barely audible, words that cut through the room with unexpected clarity. "He's gone, right?" The nurse froze. Doctors exchanged glances. The question was noted carefully, documented verbatim in the medical record. Laura's heart rate climbed again, and a mild sedative was administered to prevent shock. Within minutes, she drifted back into sleep. But the damage, or perhaps the revelation, had already been done. There was a he. Someone had been there with them. Someone who mattered enough, terrified them enough, to be the first thing Laura thought of upon waking. Deputy Reed was informed immediately. He stood in the hallway outside Laura's room, reading the note twice before folding it into his pocket. The case, already criminal in nature, now had confirmation from the only source that truly mattered: the victims themselves. Emily regained consciousness the following day. Her awakening was quieter. No sudden movement, no panic. She opened her eyes and stared at the ceiling for a long moment, as if checking whether what she saw could be trusted. When a nurse asked how she was feeling, Emily did not answer right away. Tears slipped from the corners of her eyes. She asked for water. She asked for Laura. When she was told her sister was alive and nearby, Emily closed her eyes again, relief and grief colliding in silence. She did not ask questions. Not yet. Doctors cautioned investigators to wait. Trauma at this scale could not be rushed. Memories would return unevenly. Pushing too hard, too soon, risked further harm. Reed agreed. But as he reviewed the medical findings that night, one conclusion solidified. Emily and Laura Carter had not survived the forest on their own. They had survived because someone else had decided, day after day, not to let them die. And whoever that person was still out there. The hospital staff moved cautiously in the days that followed, measuring progress not in dramatic recoveries, but in subtle, fragile signs of return. Emily and Laura Carter were awake now, but waking was not the same as healing. They spoke little. Most of the time, they slept. When they were conscious, their eyes followed movement more than sound, as if the world required visual confirmation before it could be trusted. Loud noises startled them. Sudden footsteps caused heart rates to spike. Nurses learned quickly to announce themselves before entering the room. Margaret Carter sat between the two rooms, moving back and forth quietly, never staying too long in either place. She spoke softly, choosing words that did not demand responses. Sometimes she simply sat and held their hands, feeling the warmth returning slowly, 1 degree at a time. On the 4th day after their rescue, Laura was alert long enough to hold a brief conversation. A trauma counselor sat nearby, positioned where she could intervene if distress rose too sharply. Deputy Thomas Reed waited outside the room, respecting the boundary doctors had set. This was not an interrogation. Not yet. Laura's voice was weak, her throat raw from dehydration and disuse. She answered simple questions first: her name, the year, where she was. Each answer came slowly, as if pulled from deep water. When asked if she knew why she was in the hospital, Laura hesitated. Her eyes shifted toward the window, then back to her mother. Margaret nodded gently, giving permission without pressure. "We were camping," Laura said finally. "We didn't leave. That was all she could manage before exhaustion overtook her again." Emily's progress followed a similar pattern, but her responses carried a different weight. She remained quiet for long stretches, her gaze distant, unfocused. When she did speak, her words were deliberate, carefully chosen, as if she feared saying the wrong thing might bring something back. On the 5th day, a nurse asked her if she remembered being found. Emily shook her head. I remember standing, she said after a long pause, and not being able to sit down. The nurse documented the statement carefully. Standing, not lying, not moving. Standing. Margaret listened from the bedside, her hands trembling slightly. She wanted to ask more, wanted answers that only her daughters could provide. But the doctors had been clear. Memory would return on its own terms, fragmented and unpredictable. That afternoon, Reed met with the hospital's trauma team. They reviewed what little had been said so far. No clear timeline, no descriptions yet. But the consistency was already notable. Both sisters referenced immobility, prolonged restraint, an inability to control their own bodies. This was not confusion, it was recall. By the end of the week, Laura asked her mother a question that caught her off guard. "Did they stop looking for us?" Margaret hesitated, then answered honestly. They never stopped caring. Laura absorbed that quietly. She did not ask who had found them. She did not ask where they had been. Instead, she turned her face away, tears forming silently at the corners of her eyes. Emily asked fewer questions, but her body reacted when certain topics were mentioned. The word forest caused her breathing to change. The mention of ropes made her hands tense involuntarily, fingers curling inward as if expecting resistance. Doctors noted the signs carefully. Post-traumatic stress was already present. Whatever the sisters had endured was not confined to memory. It was embedded in muscle, in reflex, in silence. On the 7th day, doctors agreed that brief law enforcement interviews could be attempted, carefully structured, with counselors present, and with the understanding that they could be stopped at any moment. Deputy Reed stood outside the room again, notebook closed, waiting. When Laura was asked if she felt ready to talk, she nodded once. Her first words were not about what had happened. "They moved us," she said quietly. Reed did not interrupt. "More than once," she continued, "so we wouldn't be found." The counselor watched closely as Laura spoke, ready to intervene. But Laura did not become agitated. Her voice remained flat, distant, as if describing something that had happened to someone else. "He didn't rush," she said. "He planned everything." The room was silent. Emily, interviewed separately later that day, echoed the same pattern. Different phrasing, same meaning. "He knew the forest," she said, "better than we did." Neither sister could yet provide a name, or a face, or a reason. But what they had begun to offer was something equally important: confirmation. This had not been an accident. This had not been a miscalculation. This had been deliberate. That night, Reed updated the case file with a single line that changed everything. Victims confirm prolonged captivity by unknown male suspect. The search for missing hikers was officially over. What remained was something far darker. The interviews began slowly, deliberately paced, to avoid pushing memory faster than the body could tolerate. A counselor remained present at all times, seated just out of frame, watching breathing patterns and muscle tension as closely as any word spoken. Deputy Thomas Reed started with Laura. She sat upright in the hospital bed, wrapped in a blanket despite the room's warmth. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers interlaced, knuckles pale from pressure she did not seem aware she was applying. When Reed asked her to describe the night they disappeared, Laura closed her eyes, not to escape the memory, but to enter it. They had gone to sleep early, she said. The forest had been quiet, no wind, no animal sounds close enough to raise concern. Emily had fallen asleep almost immediately. Laura remembered lying awake for a few minutes longer, listening to the river somewhere beyond the trees. Then the zipper moved. At first, she thought it was Emily shifting in her sleep. But the sound was wrong, too deliberate, too controlled. Before either of them could react, a beam of light cut through the tent, harsh and blinding. Laura raised her hands instinctively, shielding her eyes. A voice followed, calm, low, close. "Don't scream." She said the tone was what frightened her most. There was no anger in it, no urgency, just certainty. The man stood outside the tent, blocking the exit. Laura could not see his face clearly. The light was positioned intentionally, angled so that it blinded them while leaving him in shadow. She could see the outline of his body, tall, broad-shouldered. He held something in one hand. She believed it was a knife. He told them to move slowly, to do exactly what he said. They obeyed. Once outside, the cold hit them immediately. The man worked quickly, using plastic zip ties to bind their wrists behind their backs. His movements were efficient, practiced. He did not hesitate. He did not speak beyond simple commands. Don't run. Don't look at me. Laura said she remembered thinking, briefly, that if they screamed loudly enough, someone might hear them. But the forest swallowed sound. The man seemed to know that. He forced them to walk. They moved through the darkness for what Laura estimated was over an hour. Time became unreliable almost immediately. The ground was uneven. Roots and rocks caught their feet. They stumbled more than once, but the man did not slow down. When Emily fell, he pulled her back up without speaking, tightening the restraints when she cried out. Eventually, they reached another clearing. There was a tarp stretched between two trees low to the ground. A large backpack leaned against the trunk. Supplies were arranged neatly nearby, as if the space had been used before. This was not something he had assembled that night. This was a place he already knew. He tied them again, this time with rope. Ankles, knees, torsos. He secured them to separate trees, close enough to see each other, but not close enough to touch. Laura said she tried to talk to him then. She asked what he wanted. He did not answer. He gave them water from a metal canteen, just a few sips. Enough to quiet their panic, not enough to satisfy thirst. He left them there through the night, returning briefly before dawn to check the bindings. Days blurred together after that. Laura lost track of time quickly. The man returned twice a day, sometimes more, sometimes less. He brought small amounts of food, pieces of dried fruit, crackers, occasionally jerky. Always the same pattern. Enough to keep them alive. Never enough to make them feel human. He moved them frequently. Every few days, sometimes sooner, he would untie them just long enough to force them to walk again. Each new location was deeper in the forest, farther from any trail. He chose terrain carefully, favoring rock and hard ground where footprints wouldn't last. He erased signs of movement behind them, brushing away disturbed soil, snapping branches to disguise paths. Emily's interview confirmed every detail. She described how the man navigated the forest without hesitation, even at night. He never used a map, never checked a device. He moved with the confidence of someone who had memorized the land over years, possibly decades. He knew where we were, Emily said. All the time. The most unbearable part, both sisters agreed, was the standing. They were not allowed to sit for long, not allowed to lie down. Most of the time they were tied upright, leaning against trees to keep from collapsing. When their legs gave out, the ropes caught them. When they begged to rest, the man ignored them. The pain was constant. Muscles cramped until they shook, joints burned, skin split where rope rubbed against it day after day. Insects found the wounds, cold settled into their bones. Laura said that after the first few weeks, she stopped feeling hunger as a distinct sensation. It became background noise, dull and unrelenting. Sleep came in fragments, broken by pain and fear. The man rarely spoke. When he did, it was not to threaten them. It was worse than that. His voice remained neutral, detached, as if he were observing something rather than participating in it. On one occasion, Emily asked him why he was doing this. He paused, just long enough to make her hope for an answer that made sense. "I wanted to see how long you'd last," he said. That sentence stayed with her more than any physical pain. From that moment on, Emily understood something fundamental. This was not about ransom, not revenge, not desire. They were not obstacles or enemies. They were subjects. Laura described moments when she heard voices in the distance, search teams calling names. Once, she was certain she heard a helicopter overhead. Each time, the man reacted immediately. He gagged them with strips of cloth, standing perfectly still, listening until the sound passed. Then he removed the gags and resumed his routine as if nothing had happened. Weeks turned into months. Their bodies deteriorated slowly. Hair fell out, teeth loosened, menstrual cycles stopped. Hallucinations began, lights flickering at the edges of vision, voices that weren't there. Emily recalled speaking to people who did not exist, convinced for brief moments that rescue had arrived. The man documented everything. Laura said she saw him writing in a notebook on several occasions. He watched them carefully, sometimes for long stretches, eyes distant, expression unreadable. He adjusted the amount of food and water they received based on their condition. When one of them weakened too quickly, he compensated just enough to stabilize them. He never let them die. Near the end, something changed. He stopped moving them. Instead, he brought them to the final location, the tree where they were eventually found. The ropes were tighter, more secure, wrapped around the trunk multiple times. Their chests were compressed enough that breathing became difficult. He stepped back and looked at them for a long time. Then he turned and walked away. Laura did not know how long he was gone. Hours, days. Time no longer had structure. She remembered Emily whispering her name, telling her she loved her. She remembered thinking this was how it would end. Not with violence, but with quiet abandonment. Emily remembered the cold, the weight of her own body pulling against the restraints, the moment when holding herself upright became impossible. After that, there was nothing. When Laura finished speaking, the room remained silent. Reed did not interrupt. The counselor waited until Laura's breathing changed, until the tension in her hands eased slightly, before ending the session. Emily's interview concluded in much the same way. 2 accounts. Independent, consistent. What they described was not chaos. It was control. And as Reed closed his notebook that evening, one thought eclipsed all others. Whoever had done this had not lost control at the end. He had chosen to leave. With the sisters' testimony recorded and verified independently, the investigation entered a new phase. What had once been a search through terrain now became a search through patterns. Deputy Thomas Reed began by stripping the case down to behavior. The man described by Emily and Laura was not impulsive. He did not react emotionally. He did not escalate unpredictably. Every decision, from the timing of the abduction to the movement between locations, suggested long-term planning. He waited until nightfall. He used light strategically. He chose restraint over violence. He controlled variables. Most telling of all, he understood the forest in a way that went beyond familiarity. He navigated without hesitation. He avoided soft ground where tracks would linger. He selected locations that limited visibility and sound. He erased his presence as he moved. These were not the habits of a casual camper or opportunistic criminal. They were the habits of someone who had lived this way for years. Reed consulted with behavioral analysts from the state and federal level. The profile that emerged was unsettling in its clarity. The suspect was likely male, middle-aged, physically capable, and accustomed to solitude. He was not motivated by money, sex, or anger. His behavior showed no interest in domination through humiliation or overt cruelty. Instead, he displayed what analysts referred to as instrumental control, inflicting suffering not for pleasure, but for observation. In other words, the pain was a means, not the goal. The man's restraint was itself a clue. He did not beat the sisters. He did not kill them when escape might have been easier. He calibrated deprivation carefully. Food, water, movement, rest. Everything was measured. This suggested a mindset closer to experimentation than rage. Another detail stood out. He had allowed them to be found. If his goal had been disappearance, the forest offered countless ways to ensure that outcome. Instead, he left them bound in a visible configuration, upright, preserved, alive just long enough to be discovered. It was not an act of mercy. It was a conclusion. Investigators began reviewing past contacts within and around the Northridge Forest. Rangers were interviewed. Long-term staff were asked to recall individuals who appeared frequently but left little trace. The focus shifted toward those who lived on the margins, people who avoided registration systems, who camped illegally, who were comfortable disappearing for weeks at a time. One name surfaced quietly during these conversations. A former ranger, now retired, mentioned a man he had encountered sporadically over the years, someone who never stayed in one place for long, someone who knew restricted areas better than most staff, someone who seemed to resent hikers though he never confronted them directly. He moved like the forest belonged to him, the ranger said, like we were the visitors. The man had never been arrested. never formally warned. He blended into the background of the wilderness, just another solitary figure among many. That detail troubled Reed. Predators who hid successfully rarely did so by force. They hid by being unremarkable. Investigators expanded their search beyond trails and campsites, focusing instead on off-grid zones, areas accessible only to those willing to travel far without support. They reviewed satellite imagery for irregular clearings. They examined records of illegal hunting, trespassing citations, and complaints from locals who reported unfamiliar vehicles parked for days at a time. Patterns began to form. Certain areas overlapped: remote drainages, old logging roads, zones avoided by casual hikers. Places where someone could observe without being observed. Forensic teams returned to the site where Emily and Laura had been found. The ropes were analyzed. Nylon, common, easily obtained. But the knots were specific, not decorative. Functional, designed to distribute weight evenly. Someone had learned this skill deliberately. Footwear impressions taken from nearby hard ground were revisited. The tread pattern did not match the sisters' boots. It suggested a heavier shoe, work boots or military-style footwear. The size was larger than average. The stride length suggested confidence, not haste. This was not someone running from the scene. This was someone leaving when they decided to. Reed reviewed missing persons cases from nearby regions, searching for similarities. There were a few that unsettled him. Individuals who vanished in wilderness areas under unclear circumstances. Hikers who were never found. Cases that lacked evidence of injury or animal activity. None could be linked conclusively, but the possibility lingered. The sisters' account of the notebook returned to Reed's thoughts repeatedly. The idea that the man documented their deterioration suggested an internal logic that did not require witnesses or validation. This was someone who answered only to himself. The forest had not hidden him. It had allowed him to hide. As the investigation narrowed, one truth became increasingly clear. The man responsible was not an outsider passing through. He was not new to the terrain. He was part of it. And if he had lived undetected for this long, then the most unsettling question of all remained unanswered. How many times had he done this before? The first break did not come from a database or a lab report. It came from memory. A week after the sisters' testimony was formally entered into evidence, a call reached the sheriff's office from a man who had not spoken to law enforcement in years. He was a former volunteer ranger who had spent most of his adult life moving between seasonal posts, rarely staying in one place long enough to be remembered. He had seen the composite description circulated internally: the height, the build, the way the man moved through the forest. It reminded him of someone he used to encounter along the outer edges of North Ridge, never on marked trails, never at campsites meant for visitors. Just a man passing through places most people avoided. He didn't like being seen, the ranger said. But he didn't hide either. He just acted like he belonged there. The man lived off-grid, slept under tarps, sometimes vanished for weeks. He never registered his presence, never asked questions. He knew which roads were rarely patrolled and which areas rangers checked only a few times a year. The ranger could not provide a name, but he could point to a region. The focus shifted southeast, toward an area where old logging roads fractured into paths that led nowhere official. Places where vehicles could be left without drawing attention. Places where someone familiar with the land could disappear quietly. Deputy Thomas Reed authorized a targeted sweep. This time, the teams did not search like rescuers. They searched like investigators. They moved slowly, watching for signs of long-term habitation rather than recent movement. Flattened ground beneath rock overhangs, trees with rope scars, fire pits concealed by brush rather than exposed. 2 days into the sweep, a drone operator noticed something irregular. Beneath a rocky ridge, partially shielded by fallen timber, was a shape that did not belong to the forest. A rectangle of darker color, synthetic. Still, ground teams were redirected. The campsite was deliberately concealed. A low tarp stretched between 2 trees, angled to deflect rain and snow. The ground beneath was compacted and lined with pine needles arranged for insulation. A fire ring sat nearby, small and efficient, its stones blackened repeatedly. This was not temporary shelter. It was a residence. Investigators documented everything before touching a single item. Inside the shelter were signs of prolonged occupation: empty food containers, a water filtration system, extra rope coiled neatly against a tree, work gloves, a pair of heavy boots drying near the edge of the tarp. Then they found the backpack. It was large, well-worn, and organized. Inside were topographical maps of the North Ridge Forest and surrounding areas, folded and refolded until the creases were permanent. Several locations were marked lightly in pencil. Circles, lines, annotations too small to decipher immediately. Beneath the maps was a small digital camera. The battery was nearly dead, but the device powered on long enough to display a grid of images. Investigators gathered around the screen, the silence growing heavier with each swipe. The photograph showed Emily and Laura Carter, not just at the end, at different stages, bound to trees in various locations, sitting on the ground, restrained, their faces thinner in each successive image. Timestamps stretched across weeks, then months. The images were not chaotic. They were composed, centered, deliberate. There was no sexual content, no overt violence. That absence made the photographs more disturbing, not less. They were records, observations, documentation. The final image was dated December 12th, 2 days before the sisters were found. The implication was immediate and chilling. He had been there until almost the very end. Forensic teams processed the site thoroughly. Fingerprints were lifted where possible. DNA samples were collected from utensils and fabric. Footwear impressions were cast from hardened soil. Everything pointed to a single occupant, and he was no longer there. Reed reviewed the evidence late into the night. The maps, the camera, the locations marked lightly in pencil. They matched the sisters' account with unnerving precision. This had not been improvisation, it had been planned. The next lead arrived from a woman who delivered mail along rural routes near the forest boundary. She recognized the description from a public bulletin and called it in without hesitation. She had seen him 3 days earlier, walking alone along a gravel service road, carrying a heavy pack, moving away from the nearest town and toward the forest. When she slowed to ask if he needed help, he waved her off without making eye contact. He had a beard, dark, streaked with gray, work boots, a look she described as empty. That sighting narrowed the window. A perimeter was established. Roads were monitored. Trail access points were watched quietly. Investigators knew better than to flood the area with visible presence. Someone like this would notice. Someone like this would adapt. On the morning the operation began, the forest looked unchanged. Snow lay undisturbed in shaded areas. The air was still. Nothing moved where it shouldn't have. But for the first time since Emily and Laura Carter had vanished, the balance had shifted. The man who had hidden for years was no longer observing from the shadows. He was being hunted. The operation began before dawn. Teams assembled quietly along the outer edges of the forest. Vehicles parked without lights, radios set to the lowest possible volume. There were no sirens, no announcements. Everyone involved understood the risk of alerting someone who knew this terrain better than they ever could. A drone equipped with thermal imaging lifted into the air just as the sky began to lighten. At first, the screen showed nothing but cold, trees, snow-covered ground, rock faces holding the night's chill. Then, a single point appeared. A faint heat signature moving slowly east, deeper into the forest, roughly half a mile from the abandoned campsite. The figure stopped briefly, then changed direction. Deputy Thomas Reed watched the monitor without blinking. The movement pattern was deliberate, unhurried. The person was not running, not hiding. He was navigating. Ground teams moved in coordinated silence, adjusting their approach based on the drone's feed. Snow crunched softly under boots, each step measured to avoid unnecessary noise. The terrain was uneven, forcing officers to move in staggered formation, using fallen logs and ridgelines for cover. As they closed the distance, the heat signature grew clearer. A single individual, tall, broad-shouldered, carrying a pack. The drone operator whispered confirmation through the radio. The figure paused again, head turning slightly as if listening. For a moment it seemed he might sense them. Then he continued forward, unaware or unconcerned. When officers were within shouting distance, Reed gave the signal. "Sheriff's office," a voice called out sharply. "Stop where you are. Show your hands." The figure froze. For a brief moment, no one moved. The forest held the sound, amplifying the tension. Then, without warning, the man dropped his pack and ran. The chase was short but violent in its urgency. He moved fast, navigating through trees with practiced ease, leaping over fallen branches, ducking beneath low limbs. He did not look back. Officers followed, boots slipping on packed snow, radios crackling as positions were updated in real time. One of the younger deputies managed to cut him off by circling around a stand of firs, emerging into a narrow clearing just as the suspect burst through from the opposite side. They collided in that moment of surprise. The deputy stumbled backward, regaining his footing as he raised his weapon. "Get on the ground," he shouted. "Now!" The man hesitated. His chest rose and fell steadily. His beard was thick, dark with strands of gray. His eyes were open, focused, and disturbingly calm. There was no panic in his expression, no anger, just calculation. Slowly he raised his hands. He knelt. When other officers closed in, weapons trained on him, he offered no resistance. He allowed himself to be handcuffed without protest, gaze drifting briefly toward the trees as if memorizing them one last time. When Reed arrived moments later, he recognized him immediately. The face matched the composite sketches almost perfectly. The build, the posture, the stillness. This was the man the sisters had described, the one who moved without hesitation, who spoke without emotion. Reed asked his name. "Vincent Lowell," the man replied. His voice was flat, controlled. He did not ask why he was being arrested. He did not ask about the charges. He did not look surprised. As officers searched the dropped pack, they found additional rope, a folding knife, a metal canteen, and a small notebook sealed inside a plastic bag. Its pages were filled with handwritten notes, dense and precise. Lowell watched as the items were removed, his expression unchanged. He was read his rights on the spot. He acknowledged them with a single nod. The walk back to the vehicles was silent. Snow continued to fall lightly, settling over footprints that would soon vanish. The forest absorbed the scene without reaction, as it always had. As Lowell was placed in the back of the patrol vehicle, Reed caught a final look at him through the open door. There was no fear there, only a quiet, unsettling detachment. The man who had hidden for years among the trees had finally been removed from them. But as the door closed and the engine started, one thought lingered in Reed's mind, heavier than relief. The forest had not changed him. It had simply given him a place to disappear. The interrogation room was small, windowless, and deliberately plain. A metal table, 2 chairs, fluorescent lights that offered no shadows to hide in. Vincent Lowell sat alone, hands cuffed in front of him, posture relaxed, eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the wall. He did not ask for a lawyer. When Deputy Thomas Reed entered the room, Lowell looked up calmly, as if acknowledging the arrival of someone he had been expecting. There was no hostility in his expression, no fear, no urgency. Reed began with procedure: name, date of birth, place of residence. Lowell answered each question without hesitation. When asked where he had been living, he shrugged slightly. "Wherever it made sense," he said. "Mostly in the forest." Reed asked him about Emily and Laura Carter. Lowell did not deny knowing them. "Yes," he said. "I encountered them in September." The word "encountered" landed heavily in the room. Reed asked him to explain what he meant. Lowell leaned back slightly, considering the question as though it required precision rather than justification. "I observed their campsite for several hours," he said. "I waited until they were asleep." He described the abduction without emotion, the flashlight, the zip ties, the controlled pace. He spoke as if reciting steps from memory, not recounting a crime. He confirmed that he had moved them repeatedly to avoid detection, choosing locations where sound and scent would dissipate quickly. When Reed asked why he had taken them, Lowell paused for the first time. "I was curious," he said finally. The simplicity of the answer unsettled everyone in the room. "Curious about what?" Reed pressed. "How long the body could endure," Lowell replied. "What happens when comfort is removed gradually? How people adapt." Reed asked him if he understood that what he had done caused extreme suffering. Lowell nodded once. Yes, suffering was part of the process. There was no defensiveness in his tone, no attempt to justify his actions morally. He spoke as someone explaining a natural phenomenon. Reed asked him why he had given them food and water instead of letting them die. Lowell tilted his head slightly. Death wasn't the point, he said. The process was. The room fell quiet. Lowell explained that he adjusted their intake based on physical deterioration. When one weakened too quickly, he compensated. When their condition stabilized, he reduced support again. He described this calibration with clinical detachment, referencing notes he had taken to track changes over time. Reed asked him about the photographs. Lowell acknowledged them readily. Documentation, he said. Without it, observation is incomplete. When asked why he had abandoned the sisters instead of killing them, Lowell's answer was measured. The experiment was finished, he said. They had reached the limit of what I was studying. Reed asked him if he expected them to die after he left. Yes, Lowell replied. Within a day or two. And how did he feel when he learned they survived? Lowell considered the question carefully. Surprised, he said. Interested, nothing more. No remorse, no anger, no satisfaction. Reed asked him if he had done this before. Lowell did not answer immediately. His gaze drifted briefly toward the table, then returned to Reed. I don't see why that matters now, he said. The refusal was noted. As the interrogation continued, Lowell provided details that corroborated the sisters' accounts precisely. Locations, timing, methods. He did not minimize his actions. He did not exaggerate them either. Everything he said aligned with evidence already collected. The absence of emotional response became its own form of testimony. Lowell did not perceive himself as a villain. He did not see Emily and Laura as victims. In his framework, they were variables, data points, living systems under observation. When Reed asked him if he believed what he had done was wrong, Lowell's answer was quiet and unwavering. I understand that society says it is, he said, but nature doesn't. The interrogation ended shortly after. Lowell was escorted back to his cell without incident. He did not look back. He did not speak again. Outside the room, Reed closed the file slowly. The answers were there. The facts were clear. And yet, the truth felt heavier than expected. The sisters had survived not because their captor had failed, but because he had chosen to stop, and that realization lingered long after the door to the interrogation room had closed. The trial began in early spring, when the snow had finally retreated from the lower elevations, and the forest roads reopened. By then, the story of Emily and Laura Carter had spread far beyond the county where it began. Reporters filled the benches behind the gallery. Sketch artists worked quietly near the aisle. The courtroom carried attention that did not need to be announced. Vincent Lowell entered without spectacle. He wore a plain suit provided by the state. His beard had been trimmed. His posture was unchanged. Upright, composed, eyes steady. He did not look toward the gallery. He did not acknowledge the cameras. When he took his seat beside defense counsel, he folded his hands and waited. The charges were read slowly and clearly. 2 counts of aggravated kidnapping, 2 counts of assault in the first degree. Additional counts related to unlawful restraint and crimes committed on federal land. Each charge carried weight on its own. Together, they formed a picture that was difficult to comprehend in full. The prosecution began with facts. They laid out the timeline, the campsite, the missing equipment, the photographs recovered from the off-grid shelter, the medical records. Each element was presented without embellishment, allowing the accumulation of detail to speak for itself. Jurors were shown images from the camera, selected carefully to avoid unnecessary shock. Even so, the effect was unmistakable. The progression of time was visible on the sisters' faces, their bodies growing thinner, their eyes duller. Expert witnesses followed. A forensic specialist explained the rope patterns and knot placement, pointing out how weight had been distributed to keep the victims upright. A medical examiner described the injuries in clinical terms: ligature marks, muscle atrophy, hypothermia, explaining why survival under those conditions was statistically improbable without controlled intervention. When the trauma physician took the stand, he spoke plainly. The sisters were alive, he said, because someone had decided they should be. not out of compassion, but out of calculation. The defense attempted to frame Lowell's actions through mental health. A psychiatrist testified that Lowell exhibited traits consistent with severe antisocial personality disorder and detachment from social norms. The implication was clear. He did not process morality the way others did. The prosecution countered with equal precision. Another expert explained that Lowell's behavior demonstrated planning, adaptability, and awareness of consequences. He had taken steps to avoid detection. He had altered his behavior in response to perceived threats. These were not the actions of someone unaware of wrongdoing. The most difficult testimony came from Emily and Laura. They entered the courtroom together, moving slowly, accompanied by a counselor. They did not look at Lowell as they took their seats. When they spoke, their voices were steady but restrained, as if emotion had been carefully contained rather than absent. Laura described the night of the abduction without embellishment. The flashlight, the voice, the walk through darkness. She paused only once when describing the standing, the inability to rest, the sense that time had dissolved into pain. Emily followed. She spoke about the notebook, the watching, the moment she realized they were being observed rather than threatened. Her voice did not rise when she repeated the sentence that had defined everything that followed. "I wanted to see how long you'd last." In the gallery, Margaret Carter lowered her head, hands clasped tightly together. Lowell did not react. He sat motionless, eyes forward, expression unchanged. He did not avert his gaze. He did not challenge their accounts. He offered no visible response at all. Closing arguments were brief. The prosecution did not appeal to outrage. They appealed to responsibility, to the idea that deliberate cruelty, no matter how calmly executed, required consequence. The defense asked the jury to consider intent, impairment, and the limits of punishment. Deliberations lasted less than a day. When the jury returned, the room grew still. The verdict was read clearly, count by count. Guilty on all charges. There was no outburst, no gasp, just a quiet release of breath from the gallery as the reality of the decision settled in. Sentencing followed 2 weeks later. The judge spoke deliberately, acknowledging the severity of the crimes and the calculated nature of the harm inflicted. He noted that Lowell had treated two human beings as systems to be tested, rather than lives to be respected. He spoke of deterrence, of protection, of the need to ensure that such actions could never be repeated. Vincent Lowell was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. As the sentence was read, he nodded once. A small, almost imperceptible movement. He did not speak. He was led from the courtroom without resistance, disappearing through the same door he had entered. Outside, the cameras waited. Inside, the room emptied slowly. The legal process had reached its conclusion. But for those who had lived through what followed the verdict, the story was far from over. Recovery did not begin with relief. It began with silence. In the weeks following the sentencing, Emily and Laura Carter returned to a life that no longer fit them. Their bodies healed unevenly. Muscles regained strength slowly through physical therapy sessions measured in inches and minutes. Nerve damage lingered in hands and feet, leaving patches of numbness that came and went without warning. Standing for long periods remained difficult, even months later. Doctors focused on function, movement, stability. The mind proved less predictable. Emily struggled with sleep. Nightmares arrived without structure, fragments rather than scenes. Light cutting through darkness, the pressure of rope against skin, the sensation of being watched without being seen. She learned to sleep with a lamp on, not for comfort, but to anchor herself to the present. Darkness no longer felt neutral. Laura reacted differently. She avoided stillness. Silence unsettled her. She filled her days with activity, cleaning rooms that were already clean, walking short loops around the neighborhood, keeping her body in motion as if stopping might allow memory to catch up. Therapy sessions helped, but progress was uneven. Some days she spoke freely. Others she shut down entirely. Both sisters avoided forests. Even small parks triggered physical reactions, tightened breathing, racing thoughts, involuntary scanning of surroundings. Their therapists explained that trauma rewired instinct. What had once been background noise The sound of wind in trees, the creak of branches, now registered as threat. Margaret Carter remained a constant presence. She attended every appointment she was allowed to. She learned the language of trauma without fully understanding it. Hypervigilance, dissociation, somatic memory. Words that described what she could see but could not feel for them. Her relief at having her daughters back was layered with guilt she never voiced, the guilt of having survived the waiting. The family did not return to normal. They constructed something adjacent to it. Emily eventually resumed photography, but her subject matter changed. She no longer sought isolation or vast landscapes. Her work focused on controlled spaces, urban edges, human structures, places with clear boundaries. When asked about the shift in interviews she rarely granted, she described it simply, "I need to know where I am," she said. Laura returned to teaching part-time. Being around children grounded her, gave her a reason to focus outward rather than inward. Still, certain moments caught her off guard. Locking classroom doors, emergency drills, unexpected noises in hallways. Each required conscious effort to remain present. Public attention faded slowly. At first, strangers recognized them, offered sympathy. Asked questions they did not always know how to answer. Over time, interest shifted elsewhere, as it always did. The story became a reference point rather than a headline. The sisters did not object to that. They did not speak publicly about Vincent Lowell. They did not attend further hearings. His existence was acknowledged only when necessary, confined to court documents and official records. Knowing where he was mattered, thinking about him did not. Therapists warned them that recovery would not follow a straight line. Progress would stall, regressions would occur, certain memories might never return fully, while others would surface unexpectedly years later. They learned to accept that healing did not mean erasing what had happened. It meant carrying it without letting it dictate every choice. Margaret sometimes drove past the turnoff to Northridge Forest without realizing it until it was behind her. Each time she felt a familiar tightening in her chest. The forest remained where it had always been, unchanged, indifferent, offering no indication of what it had concealed. For Emily and Laura, survival did not feel like victory. It felt like responsibility, to continue living, to build routines that held, to acknowledge fear without surrendering to it, to accept that some doors, once opened, never closed completely. They were alive, but the months they had lost remained unreachable, suspended in memory and silence, belonging to a version of themselves that no longer existed. The forest remained. Long after the helicopters were gone, after the evidence markers had been removed and the ropes cut away, Northridge Forest returned to its quiet routine. Snow melted. New growth pushed through the soil. Trails reopened. Hikers passed beneath the same trees without knowing what had once unfolded there. The tree still stood. Its bark bore faint scars where rope had pressed into it for weeks, marks that would fade with time, indistinguishable to anyone not looking for them. Nature reclaimed the space efficiently, as it always did. It did not remember. It did not judge. For Emily and Laura Carter, the forest became a place that existed only in memory. They did not return. They did not need to. What had happened there traveled with them no matter how far they went. Investigators eventually closed the case file. Vincent Lowell remained incarcerated, serving multiple life sentences without the possibility of release. Psychological evaluations described him as emotionally detached, highly controlled, and unmoved by consequence. He did not seek contact with the sisters. He did not offer apology or explanation beyond what he had already provided. In interviews years later, officials acknowledged something they could not resolve. No one knew exactly why Lowell had chosen to stop. He had the knowledge. He had the control. He had the environment to disappear again if he wished. And yet, he left. Whether it was curiosity, exhaustion, or a calculation only he understood, the answer remained locked inside a mind that offered no access. That unanswered question lingered uneasily, resisting closure. Emily and Laura survived not because the forest spared them, and not because their captor failed. They survived because he decided the experiment was over. That truth reshaped how the case was remembered, not as a story of rescue alone, but as a reminder of how fragile the boundary is between safety and harm, between the ordinary and the unimaginable. The wilderness did not hunt them. But it provided cover for someone who did. For those who followed the case, the conclusion never felt complete. There was justice, yes. There was survival. But there was also an awareness that vast places allow people to disappear in more ways than one. Not only the lost, but those who wish to remain unseen. Emily once said, in a rare public statement, that survival did not feel heroic. It felt unfinished, she said. Like something that could have ended differently, for reasons we'll never understand. The forest still welcomes visitors. It offers beauty, silence, escape, and it asks nothing in return. But for those who know what happened there, it stands as a quiet reminder that even the most peaceful places can hide intentions as cold and deliberate as the winter that once kept two sisters alive, just long enough to be found.